Rav Gidal Yo, Zichron Livrach. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Sham will have an Aliyah in the family in Nechama. Thank you for the sponsorship, Shkoyach. And also by Ayal and Sarah Steinberg in honor of the yahrzeit of Ayal's mother, Elia Daphna Bas Yosef. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, her Neshama will have an Aliyah and the family in Nechama. So let's begin. We are picking up. Actually, the Memra de Kanyalahu, which is 2, 4, 6, 7 lines up from the bottom. So remember again, we were introduced to the really interesting case yesterday about the Yoledas. This week's parasha, woman gives birth and she has to bring 2 karbanos. She has to bring an olah and she has to bring a chatos. An olah and a chatos. So what happens? So the Gemara says that, let's say again she offered up her chatos and then she died. So her children go ahead and bring the olah. If, however, again, the reverse, if she offered up the olah and never brought the chatas and then died, so her children do not bring the chatas. So that distinction we understand, because halacha lemaisa in chatas lachar misa. You can't bring a chatas after the death of the owner. So the Gemara says over here, the Gemara suggests the idea that perhaps, again, the children could receive some type of atonement through the olah of their mother. So the Gemara says, L'meimra dekanyulu. Are you telling me then that when, let's say, the parent dies, that the Yarshim inherit, that the Yarshim acquire, I should say, the carbon itself? So the Gemara says, V'hamar Rabbi Yochanan, hiniach min chaloshnei banav umeis kreva. If a person, I call him Ruvain, died, and he left behind a carbon mincha, or he had pledged a carbon mincha, but he did not offer it, so he left behind the carbon mincha. He left it to his 2 sons, umeis, and then he died. Kreva, the halacha is that the carbon mincha is offered. Ve'ein bo shutfus. But ultimately, again, the sons are not shutfim in that carbon. Meaning, now Rashi says over here, ein bo mishum shutfus. Da'amrina ba'menachos v'anasachim hakol ba b'shutfus loch ilek hakaser ala mincha shnara v'nefesh. So we'll say, interestingly enough, a carbon mincha cannot be owned jointly. You can't have a shutfus. You can't have a halachic partnership in a carbon mincha. So the halach is if Ruvain dies, leaves behind the mincha, his sons offer that mincha, but there's no shutvus. And if you hold that Yarshim acquire a carbon, then there should be a shutvus, right? Then ultimately, again, both sons should go ahead and acquire the carbon, and the problem with that would be what? Nefesh amrachmana. Like carbon mincha, the Torah says there can't be 2 owners, there could only be 1 owner. To which the Gemara says, v'lo kanyelu. So you tell me then that Yarshim, that heirs, do not acquire a carbon? V'amar Rabbi Yochanan, hiniach behema l'shnei banav umeis. If a man dies, Ruvain dies, and he left behind a carbon to his 2, meaning he left behind, not that he left behind to his 2 sons, but he left behind the carbon. In other words, he died without having offered up a carbon that he had pledged. So what happens? Kreva, the halacha is that you offer up the carbon, ve'ein mamirin ba. But the halacha is that carbon is not subject to the laws of temura. Remember again, what's temura? Temura is an illegal switching of karbanos. So the Gemara says, so if you say that the Yarshim acquire the carbon, then I understand why there's no halachas of temura vis-a-vis that carbon. Why not? Because Rabbi said then the 2 sons are like shutfin, they are like partners in the carbon, top of vav. Ushutfin lo matzu mamirin. And I will say the halacha is partners cannot do temura. Partners in a carbon cannot go ahead and swap out that carbon for something else. Why not? So Rashi points out it's a very simple idea, because halacha lemaisa, the section of temura is written in the singular. So because of that, we learned that only an individual could do temura. Shutvim can't do temura. But if you say that Yarshim, that heirs, do not really acquire the carbon of their deceased parent, then what? Amuri nami lemru. Then ultimately, again, one of them should have the ability to do temura. To which the Gemara says, "Shani hasam do amakra im hamer yamir lerabos es hayorish." So ultimately, again, the Gemara says we learn out from an extra drasha im hamer yamir to teach us that even a yoresh, even an inheritor, has the ability to go ahead and do temura. Echad meimir vein shnaid mamir. However, again, despite that, the halacha is that only one person could do temura, 2 cannot. Maskif Rav Yaakov min Arpakod. So Rav Yaakov min Arpakod raises a kasha. Elame ata gabi meiser dichsiv V'im ga'ol yigal. So we'll say the pasuk by Meiser says V'im ga'ol yigal ishmi masro chamishiso yoshev alav. If you redeem your Meiser, we'll say you have to add on an extra 1/5 surcharge. So watch this. The Gemara says the Rabbos Esayoresh teaches us that not only could the owner of the Meiser go ahead and redeem the Meiser, but what? If let's say Reuven separated out his Meiser and Reuven died, his Yoresh, his inheritor, has the ability to go ahead and redeem the Meiser as well. To which the Gemara says, Hachanami echad golin shneim golin. Are you going to see over here as well that the halacha is only one person could redeem, but two cannot redeem? To which the Gemara says, now we know that that's not true. Shiny Meiser de Gabi Avu Nami Ise B'Shutfus. But say Meiser is different because even when we'll call him Reuven, even when Reuven was alive, Reuven could also have jointly owned produce, and when there is jointly owned produce, both of the partners have the ability to redeem it. Amar Bas Ravisha. So excuse me. Amar Le Rav Asi Rav Ashi. Umina I Amrit Bishlama Kanya Lahu. So going back for a second, if you hold that Yarshim go ahead and acquire a carbon, then I understand why one of them has the ability to affect Tmura. But ultimately, again, if you hold that the Yarshim do not acquire the carbon, then how is Tmura actually possible? So also listen to this. The Makdish, the person who consecrates the animal, he is the one who has the ability, he is the one who has the obligation to go ahead and add on the 5th if he redeems it. Umiskaper oset Tmura. And the one who achieves kapara through the carbon is the one ultimately, again, who is able to affect Tmura. Vahatorem mishalo al shel chavero. And if someone will say goes ahead and separates out, he's separating truma for his friend, but he's separating it from his own produce, tovas hana'ah shelo. Ultimately, again, he has the right to decide which coin ultimately to give the truma to. So we'll say this is actually a very interesting halacha. Just as a total side, the Gemara discusses over here who has different rights in certain consecrated items. So first of all, the Gemara says the one who consecrates the item is the one who has to add on the additional 5th should it be redeemed. The one who achieves kapara through the item is the one who has the power of Temura. And the last key is also quite interesting. Let's say again, my friend Reuven asks me to separate out Trumas and Maisrus. Truma, let's call it, from his produce. He's not home. He's away. He asked me, you've got to separate Truma before I left. Can you separate Truma on my behalf? I say no problem, but look, I don't want to go over to you. I don't want to go over to your house. So what do? He tells I go ahead and I separate out truma from his crop from my produce. Now you can do that, even though me'ikar adin it's ideally preferable to separate out truma what we call mina mukaf. Mina mukaf means from the proximity. So the idea is that when separating out truma, you should separate out truma from the same pile of produce that's untithed produce. But b'diavad, if I go ahead and the produce is in location A and I have different produce in location B, I could separate out produce from location B to be truma for location A. So Reuven asked me to separate out truma on his behalf. I separate out, but I separate it from my produce, and ultimately, again, it should count as truma for his produce. He'll pay me back afterwards. Let's say I, the person who separated out the truma, I have the right to go ahead and choose which Kohen gets it, even though again it's not really my truma. Even though I'm doing this for Reuven, the right, what we call the tovas hana, the right to choose the kohanic recipient, ultimately again goes to the one who does the actual act of separation. To which the Gemara says, so what we see over here is that it's only the one ultimately again who gets the kapara, who has the ability to do the tmura. To which the Gemara answers, mikviya lo mechapra, mikufya mechapra. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Umeshani, mikviya lo mechapra, mikufya mechapra. Kapara kavua, sheheyoresh bailav mamish ein lahan. Hilchach kabimincha ksher likarev, dilo shutfinhu. Aval kapara kufya, v'tsafa mamela yesh lo bahan, v'hilchach meimer. So this is actually quite interesting. The Gemara says, they kind of get what we'll call indirect kapara. That do Yarshim ultimately go ahead and inherit the carbon of their parent? And the answer is no. The answer is no. Both say. Now remember, what's the litmus test for that? The litmus test for that is if Reuven dies and leaves behind a carbon mincha. So what's the halacha? The children could offer it up. Let's say Reuven dies, keep it easy. Yaakov dies, he leaves behind two sons, Reuven and Shimon. Then what occurs? Reuven and Shimon are permitted to go ahead and offer up the carbon. We'll say, what does that tell you? What does that tell you? That Shutfin do not acquire a carbon. Why? Because if Shutfin acquired a carbon, then what? Then they couldn't offer up the mincha. Why couldn't they offer up a mincha? We'll say technicality. Carbon mincha cannot be offered up b'shutfus. There could only be one singular owner for a carbon mincha. The fact that the Yarshim have the ability to offer up the carbon mincha tells me that what? Yarshim have the right to offer up, and maybe even the obligation to offer up their deceased father's carbon, but they do not acquire that carbon. We'll say this is an incredibly important point. They are not yoresh the carbon. They are yoresh the ability to offer up the carbon, but are not yoresh the actual ownership over the carbon. But we'll say, but that being said, they still have the ability to affect Tamura. Why do they have the ability to affect Tamura? Because who has the ability to affect Tamura? He who achieves atonement through the offering has the ability to go ahead and affect Tamura. So we'll say, the Gemara suggests that the Yarshim have what we call indirect kapara through the carbon of their father. What does that mean? Does it actively atone? Does it actively atone for specific sins they may have committed? So the answer is no, but they have a general kapara, a general sense of a general atonement from general misdeeds through the offering of this carbon. So because they have even just this general atonement, therefore what? Therefore halacha l'maisa, they have the ability to affect Tamura. Incredible. Ibaylu, Kipro amashabo, olo Kipru, both another fascinating shaila. So here's what we know. In general, right, going back to the topic of offering up karbanos shelo lishman. Right, so here again, we have someone who is supposed to be offering up an ola. Instead, he offered up a shlamim. Let's say he was bringing this carbon for a particular chait. So here's what we know. Let's say if you were supposed to offer it up as an ola, but you offered it up as a shlamim, what's the halacha? What's the status of the carbon? Is it kosher? Yes, right? It is kosher, right? Ultimately, the carbon is still kosher, even if you offer it up for the first Mishnah, even if you offer it up for the wrong reasons. But what's the caveat? Good. It doesn't count towards your obligation. So ultimately, again, you still have to bring another carbon to satisfy your obligation. So we'll say now the Gemara asks another interesting question: does it affect kapara on behalf of the owner or not? In other words, let's say the owner was bringing it for a particular chait. So ultimately, again, is the carbon mechaper for the owner? Now, you say to yourself, well, that sounds like a very open and shut question. The Mishnah says that if I bring it and I offer it up for the wrong intention, it doesn't count towards my obligation. If it doesn't count towards my obligation, it sounds like what? It's not mechaper. So the Gemara entertains the possibility here that that's not necessarily true. That you could have a situation where, halachically or legally, I am still obligated to bring another carbon, but the carbon does affect some level of atonement on my behalf. Take a look at Rashi. Kipro amashabo, kachim shenizbechu shelo lishman, yikravu, utira lo al l'shem chova. So remember, the Mishnah told me that if I offered it up for the wrong reason, it doesn't count towards my obligation. V'tzarch lahavi acher, and I have to bring another carbon. Miu mibayle, im kipru alachet, shehofer shu'alav, v'nafkamina shelo yidag min hayisurim bein tayim. We'll say, interesting, what's the nafkamina? The nafkamina is, can I feel secure in the fact that I have divine protection? Can I feel secure in the fact that ultimately, again, I offered up this carbon, I know I have to legally bring another carbon to satisfy my legal obligation, but can I rely on the fact that this carbon does in fact create some level of kapara, some level of atonement for me? That's the fundamental shaila. To which the Gemara says, Amar Rav Sheshes Beid Ravidi Mistabra de Lo Kipru. It would appear quite obvious that this carbon does not affect any level of kapara on behalf of the owner. How so? Because ultimately, again, if you would think that the carbon affects kapara, then sheni lama huba. Then ultimately, again, why would I need to bring another carbon? As well, say if kapara has been affected, then why do you need to bring another carbon? Ve'elamai. So what do you have to say? Lo kipru. Ultimately, again, we will say when you bring the carbon for the wrong reason, as much as the carbon is kosher for its newly designated purpose, not only does it not satisfy my legal obligation, but what? It also does not give me any level of kapara. So we'll say if that's the case, then halacha l'maisa again, that it didn't affect kapara either. So then why is it offered? To which the Gemara says, Amar Rav Ashi, Rav Shisharei, Rav Idi Hachi Kakashile. So we'll say, Rav Ashi says, this was Rav Idi, this was Rav Shisha B'rei Rav Idi's question. I Amrit Bishlama Lo Kipru. So I'll say, ultimately again, if you want to say that such a carbon that was offered up Shalom Lishma, even though again doesn't affect any level of kapara, then Shalom Lishmo Mikoach Lishmo Kaasi. Ultimately again, then what Rabbi was saying, we still continue to offer up that first carbon white. I will say literally what this means is Shalom Lishmo Mikoach Lishmo Kaasi. Which Rabbi say means what? Which means that Halacha L'maisa, as you saw by the pasuk Motza Svasecha, even once you switch the designation of the carbon, I can still go ahead and offer up the carbon based on this new designation. Visheni lama huba, and ultimately again, why is the second carbon brought? L'chaper. So I'll say, so again, if you hold that halacha l'maisa, that when you go ahead and you offer up a carbon lishma, not only does it not satisfy your legal obligation, but what? It doesn't provide any level of kapara. I understand both carbonos. Carbon number one, I will say, is offered. Why? Because even though you switched the designation, the carbon is offered up as what? In accordance with its now newly found designation. Carbon number two has to be offered up to satisfy both my legal obligation as well as affect kapara. Eli amrit kipru. I will say, if you say that halacha l'maisa, the first carbon does affect some level of atonement, then what? Sheni lama huba. Ultimately, again, why is the second carbon brought at all? So what I said, the Gemara doesn't reach a resolution here, but the Gemara seems to indicate that halacha l'maisa, not only does the first carbon not go ahead and count towards the obligation of the owner, but what? It also doesn't go ahead and provide any level of kapara. So you'll say to yourself, well, what's the nafkamina if it provides kapara or not? So it seems to be very pashut. The idea is if it doesn't provide kapara, I need to be asking Slach Lanu Avinu Ki Chatana Ma'ashona Esser. I have to have in mind for this specific chait until the time that ultimately again I bring a carbon for kapara purposes. Good. Ibailahu. As I say the la'achar afrashim mechapra. These are really fascinating cases. What happens, I will say? So the Rashi points out that we're talking about an ola. Now remember again, a carbon ola has the ability to atone for a variety of things. Among them, the violation of an aseh. Violation of a positive commandment. We'll say, what's a simple example of a violation of a positive commandment? A person doesn't put on tefillin. Well, Shabbos could be lo saseh, Shabbos could be yisrim as well. A person doesn't put on tefillin. Right? A person doesn't put on tefillin. So we'll say, if a person doesn't put on tefillin, I'm not over an aveira. Right? Although the Gemara has some pretty serious words for someone who doesn't put on tefillin. But leaving that aside, right, I haven't violated an aveira, but rather, again, I am not fulfilling an aseh, not fulfilling a positive commandment. How do I atone for that? I was saying, ultimately, again, atonement for that is reached through the ola. Now, the Gemara has a very interesting question. What happens? So obviously, let's keep it easy. I violated 5 aseis. I go ahead and I separate out my ola, offer up the ola. I have atonement. What happens if I went ahead and I separated out my ola, and I violated or I failed to perform an aseh, a positive commandment, after the ola has already been separated, after it's been designated? Can the ola be mechaper? Can the ola atone for violation of aseis after the ola's already been designated? Or do we say no? An ola is only mechaper on anything that I've done up until the point of, bless you, of designation and separation. But once it's designated and separated, kind of we're in lockdown. And if you violate anything else, you're going to have to bring another ola for that. So the Gemara says, so Yibailu, aseh de la'achar ha'afrasha mechapra lo mechapra. Does the ola have the ability to be mechaper for the non-performance of an aseh after the ola's already been separated or not? Miyamrinon midi dehavi achatos. So do we say that ultimately again the ola should be like the chatos? Machatos the kodim hafrasha in the la'achar hafrasha lo. So say by chatos, we know the halacha is that a chatos it only atones for averis committed before the act of separation and designation. But after the act of separation and designation, what the chatas is mechaper for is locked in. So if I do anything else after separation and designation, even before what? Even before slaughter, I require another chatas. So as I could say that again, remember we already saw the pasuk that kind of links all of the karbanos together. So maybe an ola, just like a chatas only could atone for those things which were performed prior to its separation and designation. So to again, ola could only atone for those things that were done before separation designation, to which more Odilma, Lo Dami Lachatas, or maybe an Ola is not like a Chatas. Why not? Techatas Akol Chet V'Chet Boila Sui Chad Chatas. So what the way it works for a Chet is, for a Chatas is you can't bundle. You can't bundle. In other words, what do I mean by that? So let's say a person says, you know what, I committed this Aveira. You know what? Like, I learned Gana Hamuna, and I learned that principle number 2 is I'm going to sin. So, you know what, let me engage in some, cost-effective measures over here. Let's sin a couple of more times. Not intentionally, but unintentionally, of course. And I'll bring one chatas for a whole bunch of stuff. Doesn't work that way, I will say. Each individual transgression generates its own chatas liability. I will say, one of the most amazing things that we know is that when Mashiach comes, so we'll say, we're chayiv for back karbanos. Assuming there's karbanos in the Bayis Shlishi, we're chayiv for back karbanos. So mamish, can you just imagine what that is going to look like? I mean, it's going to be beautiful. But that line is going to be cued to Netanya or somewhere mamish. It's just an amazing thing. But specifically with chatas and the cost, right? Specifically with chatas. Ultimately, again, it's one chatas per customer. One chatas per sin, I should say. To which the Gemara says, so maybe Ola is not like chatas. On the flip side, when it comes to Ola, one Ola could atone for many violations of a different assays. To which the Gemara says, the chatas are like chatas v'hacha kevan dika kama asay gabe mechapra asay. Therefore, maybe asay de la'achar rashnai mechapra. So we'll say maybe we can say just like an Ola has the ability to atone for various transgressions or various violations of assays, so too it has the ability to atone for something even committed after the separation and designation of the carbon. Good morning, Mr. Schoenfeld. Tashma. So the Gemara says as follows: V'samach v'nirtza. So we'll say the pasuk says that he will do smicha. V'samach v'nirtza. He will go ahead and do smicha, and the carbon will be affected on his behalf. We'll say something about the ola. So watch this. V'chi smicha mechaperes. So the pasuk makes it sound like smicha is what affects kapara. We'll say smicha. We'll discuss this in depth, but smicha is the act of leaning on the animal. So v'samach v'nirtza makes it sound like it's smicha which affects some level of atonement. V'alo in kapara ela bedam. But yet we know that what? True kapara, we'll say, is only achieved when? Through the sprinkling of the blood. Shenemar ki adam hu nefesh shechaper elamat hamalam v'samach v'nirtza. So why does the pasuk say v'samach v'nirtza, which makes it sound like smicha affects atonement? To which the Gemara says, Shem, to tell you, elamat hamalam v'samach v'nirtza l'chaper Shem asa l'smicha shiare mitzvah. We'll say what it teaches me is as follows: if I made smicha like shiare mitzvah, we'll say what does that mean? If I make smicha like shirayim, like leftovers, what does that mean? So Rashi says of a shiare mitzvah shelo nechshava be'einav lo asa. If a person did not take smicha seriously and didn't do it, person didn't do smicha, so what's the halacha? Ma'ala alav akasav ki'ila lo kiper. The keeper. The Torah treats it as if what? He didn't achieve kapara, but he really has achieved kapara. Which I will say is interesting. In other words, the Torah is telling you that if you go in and you take the process of smicha and you treat it lightly, definition of treating it lightly, I don't do it. So the Torah says it's as if you haven't achieved kapara, even though in fact you really have. So what the Torah is trying to do is the Torah is trying to impress upon me the importance of smicha, even though what? It is a non-necessity for kapara purposes. Even though kapara can be achieved without smicha, the Torah wants me to treat it as if it is an indispensable part of the kapara process. To which the Gemara says, what does that mean? My love, the keeper asay de kodim hafrasha, lo keeper asay de smicha, davide asay de achar frasha. We'll say perhaps what that means is as follows. Perhaps what that means is that in this case of an ola, the ola, without smicha, the ola will go ahead and be mechaper for any aveira or any violation of an asay that took place prior to the separation designation. But what will the ola not be mechaper for? I will say the ola itself will not be mechaper for the non-performance of smicha. I will say, you hear this interesting shayla? The Gemara is suggesting as follows: I have an ola. I'm supposed to do smicha. Smicha is a mitzvah, say a positive commandment. Ola atones for what? Non-performance of positive commandments. I don't do smicha on my ola, which means that in the process of offering up my ola, I fail to perform a positive commandment. What's the shaila? The shaila is, can that ola atone for the non-performance of that positive commandment, which was a positive commandment associated with that very ola? So the Gemara suggests that's exactly, I've been waiting for this all morning. That's exactly the question. Because we'll say, what is that an example of? That's an example of a failure to perform a positive commandment after separation designation, but prior to slaughter. Does the Ola have the ability to atone for those type of Averis, or no? Does Ola only atone for Averos committed prior to separation designation? To which the Gemara says, maybe that's what the Gemara means. My love the keeper asay kodem afrasha. Maybe what the Brisa means to say is that the Ola has the ability to atone for positive commandments performed before separation designation. Lo keeper asay dismicha, and it doesn't have the ability to affect kapara. We'll say when. Ultimately, again, on the asay of smicha, or the failure to perform the asay of smicha. Dahavile asay del achar afrasha, because they'll say that is the non-performance of an asay in the aftermath after separation designation. Incredible. Amarava. Asay dismicha kamer. So we'll say, just so you understand, we're asking just what, this is the one very simple question we're talking about. Everyone agrees that an Ola atones for failure to perform positive commandments. And everyone agrees that one Ola could atone for what? Right? Many non-asays, we'll call it, I don't want to call it violations because it's not a violation, but we'll call it many acts of non-performance. The fundamental shayla we're asking is, does it only atone for a violation of asays prior to separation designation, or no? You're going to keep building up whatever you wanted to atone for up until the point of slaughter. That's the fundamental shayla. Amarava, asay dismicha kamed. Now, everyone will agree. We'll say when you talk about the Ola having the ability to atone for the non-performance of smicha, that's different. Shani hasan dechol kama delo shachit ba'amud v'samach koi. We'll say ultimately again, smicha is different. Why? Because the obligation of smicha, we'll say, applies until when? Until the point that the animal is actually shechted. Emas kahavi asay, right? When ultimately again, when emas havi asay, we'll say at what point in time is it considered as if I have violated the asay of shchita? It's when I will say it is la'achar shchita. The only time I violate the asay of not performing smicha bosai is when? After the ola is slaughtered. And everyone agrees, la'achar shchita lo kaim badan. I will say everyone agrees that what? That the cutoff, the latest possible cutoff for the atonement ability, or we'll call it atonement load of a particular carbon is when? Is shchita. Everyone agrees that the carbon can't atone for anything that occurs after the shchita. That makes sense. So we'll say, what the Gemara answers over here is, everyone will agree that an ola, the ola, cannot atone for its own non-performance of smicha, right, on that carbon. Why? Because when do you violate the essay of not having done smicha? Only after shchita. Because again, you could do smicha anytime until shchita. After shchita, everyone agrees that the carbon can no longer atone for anything that was not already included in its previous load. To which the Gemara says, Emas kahavias. I'm sorry, just lost. Amarava asid smicha kamer shani haisam to kamad lo shachet ba'amud v'samoch koi. Emas kahavias la achar shchita lo kami bailan. Amar li Rafuna bar Yehuda Rava. I'll say last line. Ema kiper gavra. So we'll say maybe when the Brisa says before kiper v'lo kiper, what it means is as follows: kiper gavra. That ultimately again, when an individual goes ahead and brings this ola, but he didn't do smicha, so Rashi points out he achieves kapara that nitzal min hayisurim. This kapara will be enough to afford him divine protection. However, Amud Beis, lo kiper kamishmaya. Rabbi say ultimately again, Rashi says over here, lo kapi kamishmaya lenachas ruach lekono de lo ovid mitzvah min hamuvchar. Rabbi say maybe at the end of the day he has not fulfilled his obligation vis-a-vis HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he has not performed the mitzvah min hamuvchar, and therefore has to go ahead, and therefore, has to perform the mitzvah min hamuvchar. So we'll say, remember again, what we were talking about, so the Brisa said that if halacha l'maisa, a person brings a carbon and doesn't perform smicha, so we said, what's the status? Keeper velo keeper. So approach number one doesn't mean he's atonement, has atonement, but not atonement. So possibility number one is that ultimately, again, he has atonement, but we're not happy with him. We're not happy with him. Meaning, at the end of the day, even though, again, the carbon is kosher without smicha, it's as if you didn't achieve kapara, even though what? You did achieve kapara. Okay, meaning we're unhappy with you. possibility too, the Gemara has to suggest in the name of Rav Huna Bar Yehuda to Rav is that no, maybe keeper means on one hand I achieved atonement in that I have achieved some level of personal atonement, in that again I'm saved from any type of additional suffering for my sin. But Kaveh Shmaya, in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I have not really done a good job. Sometimes the boss we know in life, it's an incredible Musar as well. Sometimes in life, I could satisfy the criteria. In other words, I could check the box, but I haven't done a good job. I've satisfied the obligation. So I checked the box, but I've not done a good job. Maybe that's what we're saying over here. Check the box. Did you bring your Ola? Check. Right? Did you do a good job? Absolutely not. Got the job done, but did not do a good job. So the Gemara says, after all, Milo Tanan. Have we not learned? Vanos says it's amazing. This week's parasha. Vanos b'shemen asher alakaf. We'll say that this is talking about the kapara of the metzora. So the person stricken with tsaras. So part of his atonement process is what? Is that there's oil, right? The coin takes oil, smears it on the thumbs and the big toes and the earlobes. So the Gemara says, and then whatever's left over in the palm of the coin, he puts on the head of the metzora. So b'shemen asher lakaf lechaper alav lifnei Hashem. So we'll say the coin will take whatever leftover oil there is. Here it's vanoser b'shemen asher lakaf a coin yitin al rosh hamitaher v'chiper alav a coin lifnei Hashem. So whatever leftover oil is in the palm of the coin, he puts it on the head of the metzora. So watch this. Im nasan kiper ve'im lo nasan lo kiper. Div Rabbi Akiva. So we'll say what does Rabbi Akiva say? Rabbi Akiva says, look, if the coin puts the oil on the head of the metzora, then kapara has been achieved. But if he doesn't put the oil on the head of the metzora, then what? No kapara. Rashi says, Im nasan shirayim ala rosh metzora kiper, the kapara amatanos harosh kesiva. So the Gemara says as follows: Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omer, no, shiari mitzvahem. It's not true. Now, both say, now, where does Rabbi Akiva get this? That if you go ahead and you put the remaining oil on the head of the metzora, then he's tahar. But if not, he's not. So remember, the lashon of the pasuk is va'anoser b'shon asher akaf hakohen yitin arosh hametaher v'chiper alav hakohen lifnei Hashem. So Rabbi Akiva says the pasuk itself hinges kapara on the oil application. If the Kohen puts the remaining oil on the head of the metzora, then the metzora has kapara. If he doesn't put the oil there, then there's no kapara. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, no, not true. Shiari mitzvah, and say shiari mitzvah, means again, putting the application of the blood on the head of the metzora is like shirayim, leftovers. Leftovers, meaning it's not that it's not important, but it's not necessary. It's not necessary. No, Ranas is wrong. What did you say?
Essential.
It's not essential. Right? Of course, it is necessary. It is important. It's just not essential. So the Gemara says, "Bein nitan, bein shalom nitan, kiper." Whether the Kohen put the oil on the head of the metzora or not, the metzora achieves kapara uma'alin alav kilo kiper. But yet we treat it as what? We treat it as if he did not have kapara. So both sides say here this strange lashon. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says if the Kohen fails to go ahead and put the extra oil on the head of the metzora, so kiper velo kiper. So ultimately again, it's as if. So what we say is what? Really, he does achieve kapara, but we treat it as if he didn't achieve kapara. So what does that mean? Ma'ek hi'ila lo kiper. What does it mean when we say that he did achieve kapara, but we treat it as if he didn't achieve kapara? To which the Gemara says, "Ilema dimi boile esuye carbon achrina." If you want to say that it means that the metzora has to bring another carbon, ha'amrit bein nitain bein lo nitain kiper. You'll say that can't be because remember we just said before that meikra din he's mechupa, right? That meikra din he's atoned for. If meikra din ultimately kapara has been achieved, you can't require him to go ahead and bring another carbon. Ella kiper gavra lo kiper kamishmaya. Rather, what you have to say about say is that what happened by the metzora is the metzora has affected his personal level of atonement, but God is not happy with this. In other words, you fulfilled your obligation, but you didn't do a good job. So in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the act is deficient, but l'maisa again, the act is still legally sound. So you could have an act which is legally effective, but spiritually empty. That's the Hachanami. So why don't we say the same thing over here? Why don't we say the same thing over here? About say by the ola that is performed without smicha, kiper velo kiper. That what does it mean? That halacha l'maisa will say that by the ola without smicha, we'll say what happens? It's kosher, it's good, but what? Lo kiper kamishmaya. Ultimately, again, such a carbon does not give nachas ruach to the Ribbonu Shel Olam. To which the Gemara says, Hasan nami kiper matan bahonos. So the Gemara says, Hasan nami kiper matan bahonos lo kiper. Excuse me, Hasan nami kiper matan bahonos lo kiper matnas harosh. We'll say, why don't you say that by the Metzora that it means something else? Kiper means, we'll say that. Remember, what's the case over here? The case over is where the Kohen did the oil applications on the thumbs and ultimately again on the ears. Thank you. So maybe when it says kiper, it means anywhere the Kohen did do the oil applications, it's mechupar. But maybe lo kiper is matnos harosh. Maybe what it just simply means is he has to do the head applications again. Tashma Rabbi Shimon Omer. Kivsi atzeres lameir. So we'll say the Gemara now switches gears for just a moment. So remember, it doesn't appear, we're still stuck a little bit on this intriguing lashon, ultimately again, of kiper, lo kiper. About ultimately again, what does it mean? What does it mean that there is kapara, there's not kapara? So the Gemara says as follows: Kivsi atzeres shlam ninu. So we'll say the kivsi atzeres, which are the lambs, which are offered up on Shavuos, shlamim ninu. Ultimately, again, they are a karban shlamim. So we'll say there's a very strange verbiage over here. Ela si'iri atzeres lamahin boin al tumas mikdash v'kadashav. We'll say, why are the Seirim of Shavuos brought? We'll say, so what they atone for is Tumas Mikdash V'Kadash. We'll say, remember again, we saw this in our Shavuos days, right? That ultimately what? That if you go ahead, the Seirim of Shavuos have, it's not just Shavuos by the way, it's the Seirim of every Yom Tiv, have the ability to affect atonement if somebody inadvertently went ahead and either entered into the Beis HaMikdash in a state of Tumah or offered up Karbanos in a state of Tumah. Nizrak Damo Sharishon, Sheni Lama Karav. Ultimately, again, but once the first kavet, once the first lamb is offered, why do I need the second one? To which the Gemara says, Sheni lamakarav al tuma she'ora bein zeh lozeh. It must be for what I was saying. It must be for an act of tumah that occurred between offering number 1 and offering number 2. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Sheni lamakarav v'alo rishon kippur tuma shofar. We'll say, see, Gemara has an interesting question. If you're telling me that the kivsi atzeres, the lambs offered up on Shavuos, have the ability to atone for tumas mikdash v'kadashav, inadvertent entry into the Beis HaMikdash in a state of tumah, or inadvertent offering of karbanos in a state of tumah, so we'll say, what are only 2? Or why can't one lamb atone for that? What does the second one come for? So the Gemara suggests it must be that lamb number 2 comes to atone for any acts of tumas mikdash v'kadashav that may have occurred when? Between 1 and 2. Look at Rashi. Bein zelazeh, kasaka daitcha bein hakravaso shalzeh lakravaso shalzeh. To which the Gemara says, Amar me'ata, ruin ha'yisrael lahakriv karbanos b'chol eis u'b'chol shah. So let's say in reality, really we should be offering up karbanos all the time for the possibility of tumas mikdash v'kadashav. Ella shechisei chakasav. But the Rebbe Shalom has Rachmanas on our wallets, and therefore again does not require us to constantly offer up karbanos on behalf of Tumas Mikdash v'Kadashav. So we'll say, so Mahal da'aseh de la'achar afrasha v'chavachapra. Now we'll say, now again, now you see over here that what's happening? We're assuming now that we're going ahead and we're separating out these kavasim, these kivsi atzeres, these lambs. We're offering up 1, then offering up 2. Why am I offering up 2? In the event that any act of Tumas Mikdash v'Kadashav occurred in between 1 and 2. So the Gemara says, but 1 second. That doesn't make, not that it doesn't make sense, but what does that show me? But let's say, now we're assuming right now that 1 and 2 were separated at the same exact time. So we'll say, so now what's the halacha? We're telling me now that if something happened between 1 and 2, then what? 2 has the ability to be mechaper for that. Now we'll say, what does that show you? That's after 2 has already been separated. What do you see from here? That a carbon has the ability to effect atonement on behalf of something even after the carbon has been separated. To which the Gemara says, well, if the carbonos were separated at the same time, then I would agree with you. This would be a proof that a carbon has the ability to be mechaper for something even after it's been separated and designated. But we'll say, what's the case over here? We'll say the case by the kivsi atzeres is in fact they are not separated at the same time. We'll say rather what? They are separated ultimately again, one after the other. So the Gemara says, to which the Gemara says, V'leiku v'lei malekra, t'chiksiva b'ze'achar ze'ksiva. So the Gemara says, but I don't understand. If that's the case, then ultimately again, why don't you say Why don't you say v'leiku v'leimu leikra dechiksiva b'zach zaksiva? So you're going to tell me then that that's the pasuk he's talking about? They will say b'pashtos that's not the pasuk. B'pashtos when you speak about kifsei atzeres, they will say when are they separated? The pashtos is they're separated at the same time. You now want to set this up as a case of where you separate out one, and then sometime later on separate out two. In which case, when 2 is mechaper for events that occurred between 1 and 2, it's not being mechaper for things that occurred after the hafrasha, but rather prior to the hafrasha. The problem the Gemara says with that particular approach is that what? Is that Allah Lamaisa, that's not the mashmos of the pasuk. That's not the pshuta shal mikra. Papa, Karbanos Sibur Kamrit. So Papa says you're talking about Karbanos Sibur, right? Communal offerings. So ultimately, again, says the Gemara, shiny Karbanos Sibur, deleiv Bezdin Kamasna Alehem. To which the Gemara Papa says something amazing. He says Karbanos Sibur are different. Why are Karbanos Sibur different? Because at the end of the day, Bezdin ultimately goes ahead and makes a t'nai when it comes ultimately again to Karbanos Sibur. That we'll see both say Beis Din legislates certain realities when it comes to Karbanos Sibur. What those realities are, ultimately again we'll pick up with this sugya tomorrow. I just want to end off with one short thought. Rabbi said today is Yom Ha'atzmaut. Today, ultimately, again, is the 70th anniversary of the establishment of the State of Israel. And, I've given a couple of shiurim over the last few days related to this, and I kind of always begin in the same way, which is that all too often, this day serves as a point of dissent within Klal Yisrael, right? What do you do? What do you do? How do you do? And that's somehow, again, our Zionist credentials or our Abbas Yisrael credentials are all determined by whether or not the person says a few chapters of Tehillim with a bracha, without a bracha. I mentioned last night in the shir that Rav Meshulam Roth was the Kol Mevasser, went ahead and makes a very compelling argument for halal with a bracha on Yom Ha'atzmaut. But he says, I'm nervous to go ahead and paskin in this way. Why? Because I'm nervous that it's going to create dissent in Klal Yisrael. So you see that even someone who was convinced of the halachic legitimacy, when weighing everything together, there's nothing more important for Klal Yisrael than Achdus. So whatever a person does today, doesn't do today, that's one's own cheshbon that everybody has to figure out. Rabbi say, but no matter, and the same way that no matter whether we see the establishment of the State of Israel as a part of the Messianic process or not of the Messianic process, that's also, Rabbi say, that's to a certain degree a detail. That's a detail that each and every one of us have the right to arrive at our own conclusions regarding this detail. But the important part to remember is that no matter whether you say halal, don't say halal, no matter whether you think it's aschalta du geula, not aschalta du geula, say Klal Yisrael was given a great gift 70 years ago that we didn't have for 2,000 years. That for the first time in 2,000 years, we are privileged to have access to our land. We control the borders. We control who comes in and who goes out. That we have a homeland that is accessible to us any time we want it. For 2,000 years, after being under the thumb of every single despotic and unpredictable ruler, we have the ability to have a land of our own, to have an army of our own, to have an Eretz Yisrael protected by Am Yisrael. Bose is an incredible and overwhelming zuchus. A zuchus ultimately, again, that we have to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu, however we're going to do it. The proliferation of Torah is unparalleled, right? People often have this idea that pre-war Europe was like the epitome of Jewish accomplishment. I would say in pre-war Europe, almost everyone was ignorant, right? It was pervasive amaratzos. It's true, incredible observance as well, but incredible. We live in a different time. The proliferation of yeshivas, of kololim, of centers of Torah, specifically rooted in Eretz Yisrael, is historically unprecedented. Unprecedented. And we have to give shevach v'odah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for this incredible gift. Rabbi Nachman has an incredible insight. Not on Yom Ha'atzmaut, but Rabbi Nachman says something dramatically amazing. Although I'm sure somebody can tweak it. He says, when the Meraglim came back from delivering their disastrous report about Eretz Yisrael, so they say, we can't go into the land because it's an Eretz Ocheles Yoshvahi. It's a land which consumes its inhabitants. Rabbi Nachman says, they were absolutely right. Eretz Yisrael is an Eretz Ocheles Yoshva. When you step into that land, it envelops you. When you step into that land, it overtakes you. You see, You could be in any other land in the world, and it's very nice and very beautiful. There are so many beautiful places that Hakadosh Baruch Hu created in this world, and it's incredible and it's overwhelming. But, and beautiful, magnificent, it doesn't penetrate and permeate your soul. You can go and you can come, and there'll be wonderful memories and maybe even wonderful attachments, but it doesn't permeate your soul. There's only one land on the face of this earth which permeates your soul. There's only one land which eats you up and totally consumes you, and that's Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Nachman says the Meraglim were spot on. It is an Eretz Ocheles Yoshveha. It is a land that consumes you on the inside and on the outside. And I will say that's the great gift that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us 70 years ago. Even if you hold that it's Aschalta de Gula, the founding of the state is the beginning of redemption, one thing is clear, which is what? It's certainly not the be-all, end-all of redemption. There's more redemption that still has to come. There's Mashiach, there's a Beis HaMikdash, there's Kibbutz Galus, there's so many things. But it's incredible to think that we celebrate today that 70 years ago, another dramatic step forward occurred. And it behooves each of us to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for this great gift. It behooves each of us to figure out how do we strengthen our connection to Eretz Yisrael, because it's so important. Even if we don't have imminent plans to live there, and even if we don't go necessarily, regularly, person always has to strengthen their ties to Eretz Yisrael. However you do that, whether a person supports causes in Eretz Yisrael, whether a person has kavana during the Mishaberach for the soldiers of the IDF, whether a person in Shmona Esrei when he says V'Yushalayim Ircha Barachamim Tashuv V'Sechazena Einena B'Shuv Chalitzion Barachamim, when a person has Yibon Shalom, thank you for the gift of Eretz Yisrael, and I hope that some way, somehow I have the schus to get there soon. However we do it, we have to strengthen our bonds, we have to strengthen our ties, we have to strengthen our chibas ha'aretz, our love for Eretz Yisrael, and in that sechus of celebrating the historical miracle, of appreciating the great gift that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has mamish given to us, delivered to our doorstep, with incredible mesiras nefesh. We should be Zevachim Eretz Hashem to see, not just the Aschalta de Gula, we should be Zevachim Eretz Hashem to see the Shleimus HaGeula, the Sof HaGeula. It's enough of being in Aschalta. It's enough of being in the beginning. It's enough of being in the beginning stages. We need to get to the end. We need to cross the finish line. And we should be Zochem Eretz Hashem to celebrate the true Gula, the Gula of Mashiach, the Gula of the Beis HaMikdash, the Gula of a rebuilt Eretz Yisrael with all of Am Yisrael inside of it. And here Rabbi Yameinu. Amen.